happen. We'll just go ahead and start. And as we do, let's just all arrive fully in this place. So maybe perhaps think about what happened in your day prior to now, waking up, what that experience was like, what you did after you got out of bed, perhaps taking a shower, brushing your teeth, all those things that pulled at your attention, grabbed at your awareness. And follow that right up until this moment. And maybe gather all those threads back up and pull them all together and become fully present in this moment, in this space with this group of people. And as you do that, perhaps take a few long, deep breaths. And on your next breath, perhaps open your eyes and come back here. Welcome all of you. For those of you who were here for our first session in the What Matters Now series, welcome back. This is our second session in the What Matters Now series, our series throughout this fall, winter, and spring, where we're exploring the question of what matters now. What does it mean to be alive in this time of the poly crisis? And what is it important to focus on as we exist in this moment? We're here today with Scott Eberle, Maura O'Connor, and hopefully Sherri Mitchell to explore learn and unlearn. Our next session will come up on January 19th, which is a Thursday, with Bio Akomolafe, where we'll focus on leaning into the cracks. And so with that, I'll introduce our guests for today. We have Scott Eberle. Scott is an end-of-life physician and educator and an author. He is a longtime wilderness guide at the School of Lost Borders and a student of Buddhism. His first book, The Final Crossing, Learning to Die in Order to Live, explores the relationship between life and death. He co-created with Meredith Little the school's Practice of Living and Dying programs, and he is presently writing a second book, The Red Thread of Story. Maura O'Connor is a writer and a journalist on the politics and ethics of science, technology, and conservation. She is a member of the Writers and Journalists Council. Her most recent book, Wayfinding, The Science and Mystery of How Humans Navigate the World, is an exploration of navigation traditions, neuroscience, and the diversity of human relationships to space, time, and memory. Her current book, Ignition, due in 2023, is on fire ecology and prescribed burning, for which she became a certified wildland firefighter. And it seems like with Sherri not here yet, we'll just integrate her if she's able to make it. And in the meantime, we'll continue with Scott and Maura. So welcome, Scott and Maura. Thank you for being here today. So to start, I'll just ask you, what does learn and unlearn mean to you, and why does it matter now? Scott, if you like, we'll start with you. I'm not getting audio for Scott. Is it?
Here we go. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Scott.
Just to say, I'm sitting in my study in Petaluma, California, about an hour, 45 minutes north of San Francisco. As Kevin said in the bio, I've been a hospice doc for about 35 years, and also a wilderness guide for 20 plus. And on the topic of learning and unlearning, my experience as a hospice physician could and should be very relevant. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the wilderness work I do. I've been a guide at the School of Lost Borders for now 19 years. The School of Lost Borders is based in the California deserts in southeastern California. It was started about 40 years ago, a little over, by Stephen Foster and Meredith Little. And way back in the 70s, leading into the 80s, Stephen and Meredith were looking to find a way to provide a culturally appropriate modern rite of passage ceremony for youth, troubled youth in the Bay Area. And they started taking kids out into the deserts, good 6-8 hours from the Bay Area. And eventually they relocated in the Owens Valley, a little town called Big Pine, which if there is a center to where the school is, that's it. Although we now have guides in about 6 different Western states. So what I want to start with is just a brief description of the ceremony that they created many years ago, and which we've been offering to people ever since. We're saying that pretty early on, they started extending this to people of any ages, because at the heart of any rite of passage, and this is anthropological teachings that they gleaned long ago, any rite of passage involves a dying, in between, and rebirth, and those happen at every stage of life. And so what they had created for youth became obviously very relevant for people of all ages. In fact, I don't do youth work myself, and all the people I've worked with are typically 25 or older. The ceremony they created, and they were trying to strip it down to the absolute bare bones, which is to say only those things that really would support a person to have their own experience, their own ceremony, bring their own religion, worldview, whatever life story they had, and to have that then be cracked open in this bare bones ceremony. So several elements I'll emphasize. There's a few more that I won't get into, but first of all, the quintessential School of Lost Borders program is a 12-day open vision fast, wilderness fast. Begins with 3 to 4 days of prep time, and then moving into the backcountry to a very isolated place, transition day, and then people go out alone for 4 days and 4 nights. Then we return to the original base camp, and we do storytelling council back together in that previous location. The key elements of a 4-day fast are, obviously you're alone. We ask people not to go more than a half-hour walk from base camp for safety reasons. Really important to emphasize, this is not an outward bound, push your physical limits kind of experience. It's meant to be very much a spiritual practice. So alone for 4 days and 4 nights. No food for those 4 days or 4 nights, although we encourage liberal drinking of water. And then no 4-walled shelter, which to my mind is in some ways one of the most powerful elements of it, because we so seldom get the experience of 360-degree view of the world. Now to really capture, the one other bare bone element I want to emphasize as well. Prior to going out, both during the time months before, but especially during the last few days where we're in council together, just before going to the backcountry, we really encourage people to hone their reason for going out to an intention statement, to really name what's the rite of passage I'm enacting in my life right now, and how can I really bring that alive with a very focused attention and intention. And so that's a really important part of what we do. So to really bring alive this whole theme of what do you learn, what does a person learn or unlearn when you're doing this kind of exercise, I thought the best way to get that across was to tell the story of my own very first fast, 4-day fast, 22 years ago. It was midwinter over the 99-2000 New Year's. Literally went out on New Year's Eve day, out there for 4 days and 4 nights, during which the start of the new millennium began. At the time, I had been a practicing physician for about 12 years. I was an AIDS doc. I had been working, I was practicing with what I would describe as a self-righteous anger. I was a classic angry young man who had strong beliefs about what needed to be done in support of the people I was serving, which were, for a lot of folks, modern day pariahs. And so anger was a really important fuel. But what I discovered over the 10 or 12 years was I was rapidly becoming burned out, and that was not going to be sustainable for the career that I was building. So when I went out to do this fast, my intention, and they really want to underscore that, the intention was to relocate the source of the work I do, not from righteous anger, but from love and compassion. And in the months leading up to this, and especially those couple of days before I went out with the help of the 2 guides, what became really clear is I had a lot of forgiveness and apology work to do. This was a fast of atonement of the first order. And I literally said, sorry, please forgive me, and or I forgive you, to probably somewhere on the order of 30 or 40 people. You know, did it change who I am in the world? Absolutely. Am I still angry? Often. But I think it's fair to say that the shift that I was looking for absolutely happened. So 4 days, 4 nights. And just to help bring this alive a little bit, I'm sitting on the side of Telescope Peak, which is the tallest mountain in Death Valley, looming behind me 10, 12,000 feet up. I'm about 2,000 feet up looking across to Badwater, which is a dry mineral encrusted lake, the lowest point in the United States at something like minus 280 feet or so, around there. And across Badwater in front of me are the Funeral Mountains, which was so appropriate because me as a hospice doc, the whole notion that a rite of passage is a dying and in between and a rebirth was so central to what I was doing out there. So 4 days, 4 nights. And so let me tell you what I was unlearning and what I was learning. And this is really where I've been wanting to go. No human company alone. I'd been doing lots of solitary retreats in nature. So in some ways, this was familiar to me. But for many people, what they unlearn when they're doing a solo is that you don't always have to be physically connected to people, computers, devices, fast-paced civilization. It's actually possible to completely remove yourself from all of that and cultivate the capacity to be alone, which for me, and this is what's the deep learning, is how can you use solitude as a source of creative incubation? So major learning and unlearning in that realm. Second, no food. You know, for the 10, 12 years prior, I couldn't have told you this at the time going into the fast, but I had the classic, Freud says, no one believes in their own death. I did not believe I was the one who was going to be dying ever. It was my patients who were dying, and I was there to show up and take care of them. But when you go without food for 4 days, 4 nights, there's not actually a lot of biological risk to that. The school has had very few problems with people fasting over the 40 years. But there's the reality that you get. If I kept doing this for 40 days instead of 4 days, I'd be dead. And so my own mortal being, that I'm a mortal animal in this world, was made viscerally clear. So there was a deep unlearning and learning in that realm. And then no tent, no four-walled shelter. As I said already, huge part of this experience. And I think this is critical to the deep unlearning of the big lie that we humans are not part of nature. That's the big lie. And so obviously the converse, learning that I'm inextricably tied to the web of life. And even more so, here we are in the dead of winter. The sun goes behind Telescope Peak by 3 in the afternoon. It's cold already, and it's a 14, 15-hour night, and there's no clouds in the sky. Huge image of the galaxies, just of a kind I have never known any other time in my life. And in that 4 days and 4 nights, what I learned is I'm a speck of dust. I am literally just a piece of dust in the cosmos. And I cannot even begin to tell you how that all has altered my worldview since. It's in my bones, it's in my blood. But that in some ways was the deepest learning, unlearning that I wasn't part of nature, learning that more than that, I was a speck of dust in the cosmos. And then finally, the intention that I went out there, I already said I was doing a fast of atonement. I came back, you know, prior to that, I think the way I saw the world was very much in an us versus them kind of way, where there was battles to be fought, battles to be won kind of mentality, for the good and for the service of the people I was, who were part of my us. And what I learned during that 4 days and 4 nights is, well, particularly during this, the return to the circle and the storytelling that got told, is that every single one of us belongs. And my North Star, I've been a guide now for 20 years. I've guided thousands of people, a couple hundred programs. My North Star in doing this work is that whoever comes belongs. And I'll tell you that occasionally there's that really difficult person. I had one in the program I was doing a week ago, what I call wild cards. And the wild cards belong as much or more than anyone else who appears. So learning and unlearning, big part of what this journey has been about. And I'll just close by saying, Lots to learn and unlearn in the work of sitting with people who are physically dying as well. I just chose to focus on the symbolic death and rebirth work in the desert. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. What a rich start to our conversation. And we have Sherri Mitchell here now. And so Sherri, I'll introduce you and then perhaps turn it over to you to, I'm getting a note. It looks like you would like to go last. Okay, I'll introduce you now so that everybody knows who you are, and I'll turn it over to Maura after that. So Sherri Mitchell is Penobscot and Wabanaki, and an attorney, a teacher, activist, and change maker. She is the author of Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. She is the founding director of the Land Peace Foundation, dedicated to the global protections of Indigenous land and water rights, and the protections of the indigenous way of life. She speaks and teaches around the world on issues of Indigenous rights, environmental justice, and spiritual change. Welcome, Sherri. Thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, we'll turn it over to Maura. Maura, would you like to share with us what learn and unlearn means to you?
Great. Hey, everybody. Nice to see you. I'm here in Brooklyn, New York, and really pleased to have been invited to have this conversation with you all. And thanks, Scott, for getting us off on an amazing start. So I kind of identify myself as a science journalist. I cover more than science, but that's one of my main focuses. And I often think of my goal as a science journalist as to subvert narratives. So I'm really interested in questioning like some of the most basic narratives that we have about history and science, such as things like science was invented by Western European cultures, things like science is an objective practice, or that science doesn't have anything to do with cultural values. And I think there's growing awareness around those ideas and the need to deeply question them. So when I'm looking for stories, when I can find something that we assume to be true and have sort of been taught that I can start questioning and poking into, I get pretty excited. And when I was thinking about this conversation today and the learn and unlearn, sort of framework, I realized it's kind of another way of thinking about subverting narratives. I think, those are two things that are closely related. So I really like this idea of what can we learn? How do we unlearn it in order to learn new things? And about 6 or 7 years ago, one of the sort of narratives that I got really interested in was this idea that we have maps in our head. And that we navigate using maps. And you hear this all the time, that we have these cognitive maps, that it's sort of even been extended to this idea that there's this GPS in our head. And well, GPS didn't really exist, at least in our handheld form that we have them today, even 15 years ago, or at least they weren't as ubiquitous. So this whole idea that a GPS or a map was a metaphor that could adequately describe what was happening at a neurological level became really interesting to me. And as I started researching this idea, it became really obvious to me that this wasn't really a satisfying way of thinking about how we navigate the world. So, for instance, maps themselves are sort of a historical creation. We know there's this cartographic revolution, let's say about 500 years ago. And one thing I got interested in was like, well, what did people do before we had these physical maps? And so was, the cognitive map, was that an adequate metaphor for what was happening more than 500 years ago? And so my research sort of brought me to this place, which was that, as it turns out, maps are not universal at all. And the more I got interested, the more I found that there's this kind of astonishing range of human navigation systems. And you can almost look at any country, any culture, any community, and find really interesting divergences between the ways that they find their way through the world. So depending on the landscapes, wind might be a really important environmental cue. Sand, waves, city streets are, if you grow up in an urban place, the way you will learn to navigate is often by using architecture as landmarks. If you grow up in the mountains, you may use mountain peaks. So different landscapes require different practices and skills. One of the most powerful examples that I started researching and then eventually went to Australia on 2 different research trips to try to talk to people about were Aboriginal Australian songlines. And so songlines are so many things, and so many things that I won't ever really be able to fully comprehend. So they are stories, and they are actual songs, and they are history. They are also law. So they teach the right way to do things. And they tell of a time called the Dreaming when Aboriginal Australians' ancestors created the world through their movements on Earth. So everything from rocks to trees to mountains to lakes was created by these Dreamtime ancestors. But for me, getting interested in navigation was the fact that they also contained navigational information. So the song itself and the order in which you tell this song or sing the song is the movement of the ancestors. And if you follow those movements, you can make your way on the landscape. And so in that culture, the map is not really an adequate metaphor at all for how we find our way. It's more like a song. It's more like humming a tune. So that was quite profound to me. There's other really interesting things about Aboriginal Australian culture that helped me understand the sort of cultural and historical framing of my own ideas about how we move through the world. So for instance, most Aboriginal Australian communities do not speak languages that have words for left or right, and therefore do not orient themselves by I am to the left of the house. They only speak in cardinal directions. So you would say, I'm to the north of the house. And one of these really completely fascinating things is that from a young age, in order to speak that language, you have to be constantly oriented to you in relationship to this absolute coordinate system. And so I think that's very powerful because it speaks to a whole other way of seeing yourself, the world in relationship to yourself as a subjective, being moving through space, or seeing the whole world as a sort of absolute space and then yourself as just one part of it. So one of the really profound conversations I had when I went to Australia was in a town called Catherine in the Northern Territories. And I spoke to a really wonderful woman outside her house, and we were sitting, and I was interested in sort of the environmental cues that she used in the bush to find her way, which, there's some really fascinating ones. It's not just song lines, but also termite hills are oriented on a north-south axis. So if you're disoriented, you can look for a termite mound and know, okay, well, this is pointing north and this is south. And so I was like, well, what do you do if you get disoriented or you get lost in the bush? And she just sort of laughed at the question, which was a real profound moment for me of understanding that even the idea of being lost can be sort of culturally contingent. Being lost is a sort of that idea of going out into an unknown space where you don't know where you are is sort of a specific historical context that really comes from a condition of colonization, of this idea of being an explorer that's going into an unknown space in order to colonize it. And for many other cultures, that's just not something that would normally happen. It's not that disorientation can't take place, but it's that you operate within a known cosmos, and the condition of being lost would be something very, very rare, or something had gone wrong, perhaps. And so I think that kind of gave me this opportunity to think, well, what would it mean to explore? Or what's the idea? What does it mean to be at home really in the world if you never had that experience of not knowing where you are in relationship to everything around you? And I think the navigation, thinking about the metaphors we use to do it, thinking about our experience moving through the world is powerful, because what we attune ourselves to is what we value. And so if we're only looking at the clock, if we're only looking at the screen, it would seem to me that there's an argument what we're valuing is efficiency. But if we're orienting ourselves to, the people and places and changes that we're seeing in the environment, I think that over time, that reflects a very different set of values, and a very different kind of experience in the world. I think to speak just quickly to the last point of why this concept of learning and unlearning, or as I might say, subverting narratives, matters right now, is I think that the more we understand the limits of our own understandings and the metaphors that we live by and assume to be adequate or useful, the more we can expand our sense of what's possible. The more I unlearn, the more possibilities open up for the future. And I think as a writer and a journalist, that's, ultimately the most exciting thing to consider, is that there are things possible that we haven't even considered yet. So, thank you guys.
Kevin, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maura. So many powerful insights in what you just shared. And Sherri, I'll turn it over to you with the question, what does learn and unlearn mean to you, and why does it matter now? And if you would take maybe, 8 to 10 minutes or so to address that.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you to Scott and Maura for your comments. I apologize for being a little late. We had some technical difficulties on this end, and we have a heating crisis going on at the same time in the house that we're trying to resolve. So anyways, to the subject. When I thought about this, I thought about these 3 types of learning. And I was focusing on what Maura was talking about, because that really is connected to a part of the unlearning and colonization piece. My organization, Land Peace Foundation, last year did an 8-part series with the Global Council on Science and the Environment, where we worked with over 2,000 scientific scholars and climate justice activists from 40 different countries, talking about the importance of the inclusion of Indigenous voice into the narrative, because far too often we have, as Maura said, she can't possibly understand even the construct, because the structure of her mind is different than those who grew up within that tradition. And understanding the importance of allowing for the Indigenous or Aboriginal voice to tell their own stories, because they're the ones that are seated within the reality that the story is being told from. And so anything else is an interpretation of that comes through a lens of a different framework. And so, that's part of the unlearning is who can we speak on behalf of, rather than how can we make space for all voices to be heard. That's part of that decolonization work. And so when I think about this, I think about 3 types of narratives connected to 3 types of learning. Thinking about this unlearning piece, letting go of the toxic narratives that we've had for so long. That's this patriarchal imbalance that has kind of led the charge of colonization. When I think about where we are, I think about patriarchy, not in a, fatherly head of the family kind of way, but in the way of this distortion that we've been living under of imbalanced ways of being in relation to life. And this patriarchal structure, as it appears, being part of the toxic narrative that runs through all of our societies, and colonization has been the vehicle for transporting that imbalance to various corners of the world, and capitalism being its financier. And so if we think about those things and the way that they're all entangled, that unlearning is really connected to the ways that we think that equity within those systems is inclusion within the systems, a place at the table. And that has nothing to do with freedom, liberation, equity, justice. It's having the energy of our movements and our resistance subsumed by the status quo. And so there's all of this unlearning of the ways that we're deeply entangled with it and how we position and posture ourselves in order to be included within it so that we're not part of the vulnerable, excluded fringe. And so unlearning our desire to be part of these systems that are destroying life, and how do we disentangle ourselves from them without becoming subsumed by the movement itself. And the follow-up that I'm writing to Sacred Instructions is called Rise Wild, and it's really about disentangling from those systems and learning how to live in a new way. And that was kind of the main thrust of our whole series with the Global Council on Science and the Environment, is accepting that there are other ways of being other than those that have been presented to us. There are other ways of knowing beyond rationality and linear thought. And that this breaking down of the binary is part of the unlearning that can then expand our minds to have more possibilities for creative intelligence and critical thinking. And so that whole unlearning piece, is something that I teach a 15-week course on decolonizing our minds and ways of life and ways of being and knowing. And then the relearning piece, right? That relearning piece is reaching back beyond colonization, reaching back beyond the destruction of our earth-based ways of knowing and being, and bringing forward and relearning the things that we've forgotten along the way, which part of the process of colonization is the homogenization of cultures. And what that does is it strips away our cultural values. So in our cultural teachings, our moral and ethical values, our ways of being in relationship with the life that's around us, being integrated into our ecosystems are all contained within those cultural teachings. And when we strip those away in order to assimilate and homogenize ourselves into the mainstream culture, we lose the value of who we are and what we've come to know as a people through millennia of relationship with the lands upon which we live. And so that relearning is important. You have the unlearning and then the relearning of what was purposely set aside or distorted. We're doing a lot to decolonize our languages and our stories here in Wabanaki territory. And so, and then you have, the learning connected to what are the new narratives for these unprecedented times that we're living in, and how do we begin to move beyond what we've come to know as normal, what we've normalized, and build something that looks very different. How do we give birth to something that's new collectively with our visioning? And then also recognizing that we're navigating collapse. And so my partner we just taught a workshop this week together for 2 days. And one of the analogies that he gave was that we've been thinking about justice from a perspective of inclusion. I talk a lot about this inclusion piece. And so the analogy that he came up with is that, imagine that we're on the Titanic and that, the people in steerage are trying to earn their way or fight for their right to be in the ballroom, right? We have ballroom justice. And so we're all trying to get into the ballroom so that we can be included in the party. right? But then imagine, depending on the time, where we are when we hit the iceberg. All of a sudden, everybody that wants to get into the ballroom is like, the doors are open. Go ahead, go into the ballroom. Because, what really matters in that moment is lifeboat justice. And so right now, I feel like a lot of our movements are fighting for inclusion into a sinking ship. And what matters most in the moment that we're living in is this idea of lifeboat justice. How do we survive the navigation of collapse? And what are we allowing to collapse? And how can we support, Scott was telling about end of life, right? How do we support a dignified collapse of these old systems that they no longer serve us? We just take our energy out of them. We don't need to engage in acts of conquest to topple and overthrow them. We just take out the artificial life support that we're providing, let them come down, deflate, lose their power as we collectively invest our power in, paddling our boat. Part of that process is really thinking about the ways that we've come to consider the very sources of our survival, the land, the water, the air, as commodities that can be sold. The whole scam of the Paris Agreement is that it was a creation of a cap and trade market for our air, right? It was just the commodification of air in this illusion of carbon credits. And so how do we shift away from thinking about those sources of our survival as resources and rather than living beings that we're living in an interdependent relationship with? Shifting that. And then resources, let's think about resources with the Titanic analogy of ripping the doors off from all of the rooms and using those as life rafts, right? How do we, as we're disassembling the old, how do we use some of the stuff from that to as a resource to help carry us across, this flood that we're all navigating and trying to survive right now? And so shifting these ways of thinking in our minds, shifting our position within this circle of life, right? How do we think about ourselves in proper place? So I am a Skijinui-Apid. I am an Indigenous woman. Najayopana-Wabskewi, right? I am from the Penobscot Nation. And as Bana-Wabskewi, I am both part of the people, the land, and the water. We all have to share that same name because we all recognize our interdependence with one another. And so, that ski is the surface, the very surface of the earth. And Skijin is the one that walks on that surface of the earth, so that, we recognize ourselves as those who are living in relationship to this living earth. And so when I think about who I am, where I come from, who and what are my kin, it's all encompassed in me fully introducing myself in the language. It reminds me every single time I do that this is who I am, this is where I come from, these are the people that I'm connected to, and this is the territory that supports our lives and the waterways that we're connected to there. And that all of those things for me are Basilda and Dildabamuk, that's all of my relatives. And so as I'm thinking about myself in that way and shifting the way that I'm thinking about things away from this colonial mindset where everything is a resource to be commodified. Even human bodies are viewed in a way to be consumed and commodified. And so it's hard for us to even think about ourselves outside of, in relation to value, outside of monetary and economic-based language. Even when people are single, they say that they're on the market. When we think about all the ways that we've tied our sense of worth into these systems of destruction that are sucking the life out of the earth, the thing that really needs to change is our relationship to life. And so that relearning piece has to be part of renewing our sacred relationships with life. And then the learning part is how do we bring all of that together with that two-eyed seeing with an Indigenous lens for us, Chkobanakieg, what we call Skijinaway Bamausawagin, the sacred way of being in relationship to life, with the Western view. And then, not only begin to see the world in a lens that allows us to see the whole picture, but then also allows us to live in a very specific way in relation to that view on the ground and moving forward. And so I don't know if that was 8 to 10 minutes or not, but I think that's probably a good stopping place, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation. So.
Yeah, thank you, Sherri. That was perfect and really lays clear just how fundamental these shifts are, how deep the learning and unlearning process is. And so maybe now we'll just turn to a conversation. We have, maybe 10 minutes or so, and allow each of you to reflect on what you heard. So Scott, is there anything you heard from the others, any threads that you want to follow or reflect on? Yeah, you're muted, Scott.
I'll just pick out 2 things that I, in my notes that I highlighted with each of you, and thank you both, really fascinating stuff. The phrase you used, Sherri, that really resonates for me is navigating collapse. And as I referenced already, I could have led with my work as a hospice doc, because for me, how we learn to grieve and let go and lose our own individual physical bodies, but all of the people we love and everything about this planet that we so value. How we learn to grieve and let go feels to me like one of the most fundamental things we're learning. So a deep bow to you, Sherri, for, again, I love that expression, navigating collapse. And then to Maura, I would just say thank you for this notion that we might actually orient by cardinal directions, the energies and powers of the South, the West, the North, and the East, rather than, I'm going to turn left here and then turn right. It speaks to me of the ways in which we've lost our sense of being oriented to the natural world. And for me, the only way I can really tap back into that is to get as far away from the big city as I can, where left and right isn't what matters. It's what's north, what's south, what's west, what's east. So anyway, thank you both. Really, I don't know, the question so much is just really underscoring what each of you have brought to the table.
Thank you for that, Scott. Maura, how about you?
Scott, you could also come to Manhattan and navigate on the streets that are north, south, and east and west.
You can, maybe not me.
Okay. Well, I think, I was just in Northern California on the Yurok reservation, where they strongly feel that North and South is a colonizing concept that was brought with white people. And so strictly upriver, downriver navigation directions there. So it's all, it is so culturally relative. There is some science that shows, like, if you do orient on this absolute coordinates, you actually probably are really good at finding your way. So there are, some interesting findings, but I think that, the way Sherri was using navigation as this metaphor for talking about the future is really powerful. There's the literal ways we wayfind, and then there's these ways we can think about it that help us. Yeah, powerful ways of thinking about, where we came from, where we are, and where we're going, and where we want to go. And I think that's one of the reasons why this was an interesting topic for me for so long. And so I really appreciated those insights. But yeah, I'll jump in again if there's time.
Great, thank you, Maura. Sherri.
Thank you for that. I also want to mention that there seems to be like this line through here that makes me look especially bright. And I can guarantee you that it's not a halo, it's a broken computer. So if that looks a little weird from how you're seeing it, my brother stepped on my laptop and put a crack right through where my camera is. So I know it gives me the effect of being slightly angelic and a little bit pale, but that's not a reflection of the truth. I just want to disavow any allusions to that. So I think about, I feel like I had a chance to kind of comment on both Scott and Maura's talks in my little brief soundbite discussion on this very deep subject. I think one of the things that I just want to reflect on based on the comments that they just made is that this notion of being oriented with the natural world, and give an example of this thing that we had here, because we have here, I have a land-based learning campus called Wajukum Dultina, which means let's help one another. And we have ceremonial space here for people from all of the Wabanaki nations. And we had some volunteers come in who wanted to help us. And we had, really mapped out our arbor poles for a community ceremonial space. And, done it 3 times a day, at sunrise, at high noon, and at sunset, to make sure that we were aligned with the specific direction. So the direction of creation, is our first point of reference. And at the very end of the day, tying back to that idea of allowing for a graceful death, at the very end of the day, orienting ourselves with the direction of the setting sun, that direction that the those who leave life are heading toward. And so we had mapped all of that out. We had marked it for those who are going to help. And one of the very helpful non-native people who came here to volunteer decided while we were having lunch to move all of the poles that we had marked because they weren't oriented with his compass. So we had to cancel the whole day, and we had to wait until we had the opportunity to once again have a full day to be out there on that same day at exactly sunrise and high noon and or midday and at the end of the day. And it was this process of learning for everyone where this notion of being aligned with the natural world and with the movement and the flow of life is very different than compass orientation. So that it's kind of like that space in between where Scott and Maura are talking about, and we recognize that space in between as being a really critical place, right? Which is why the conversations about breaking down the binary are so important. And for us, that's where the Medewan, our Medewalan teachings and our societies are based on that understanding of that space in between is where all of the things happen. It's connected to that hollow reed idea. And so I was thinking about that. And then also, I just want to encourage Scott not to go to Manhattan to get that orientation because, what we need our feet to be magnetically oriented to the earth. We need to reconnect ourselves through that iron in our blood to the magnetic orientation of the earth so that we're guiding ourselves in that way. And there have been a lot of studies that have proven that the energy of the earth doesn't come up through pavement or asphalt. It'll come up through some forms of concrete, but not through asphalt. So, unless you're going to go to a park, then I would encourage you to go north from Manhattan.
Thank you, Sherri. And that feels like a wonderful place to conclude this part of the conversation. So I want to thank each of the 3 of you for your time today and for sharing your wisdom on this topic, this ongoing simultaneous process of learning and unlearning. So thank you all so much. And so with that, we'll turn to our breakout councils and we'll take a 5-minute break. And so maybe we'll all return on the hour for those councils, and we'll all leave from those councils. We won't be coming back into this main room here, so we'll leave directly from there. So as we leave, I want to give you all one more reminder that our next session will be on Thursday, January 19th with Bio Komalafe, leaning into the cracks. So see you all shortly.